All right.
All set?
Yeah. Don't worry. Just sit. Just es solo
Okay.
para cuadrar esto para que
Right, so that my face shows. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. So they can see my face.
Yeah. And if you move the mouse,
If I need to use the mouse,
just exactly
right here.
there.
Right.
Huh?
Yeah. Okay, that's the only thing I need to do because I flip the slides by clicking on here.
Okay.
Okay, very good. So you see the first slide there.
Yeah.
So good morning.
Good
You know,
morning.
formally, my name is Felipe Vizcarrondo. I am a pediatrician, like I think I mentioned already. I practiced pediatric cardiology for many, many years, for about 40 years, 40. And after I retired from patient care, I went back to school and I studied bioethics. And that's what the MA is, in bioethics. And that's what I do now. I don't see patients anymore, haven't for the last 10 years, 11 years. And I work at the University of Miami with the medical students in the bioethics section. Okay. So today we're going to talk about the doctor-patient relationship. And I think you've already had a talk on the doctor-patient relationship, but from the perspective of the doctor, right? Okay. It's very difficult I know that Father Chofi wants to look at the perspective of the doctor and the perspective of the patient. But it's very difficult to separate the doctor from the patient when we're talking about a relationship that is so close. There is just one doctor-patient relationship. So I thought that at the very beginning we could start with some definition of terms, and you will bear with me if I talk about a little bit of philosophy, but philosophy is important and necessary. And we won't change the slide.
With the mouse?
No. I was supposed to touch here on the down arrow.
In this?
And it doesn't work. Oh, over there? You want me to use the mouse? Okay, I will use the mouse.
Yeah.
All right, I will use the mouse. All right, definition of terms. Okay, ethics. That's what you've been doing for the last many weeks now. What does ethics do? Ethics is the branch of philosophy that deals with values relating to human conduct with respect to the rightness or wrongness of certain actions and to the goodness and badness of the motives and ends of such actions. So it's good and bad, right and wrong. Those are the issues that we will be dealing with when we talk about ethics, when we do ethical decision-making. And the focus today is ethical decision-making in the medical context. So it's medical ethical decision-making because we're talking about the doctor-patient relationship. What about morals? Morals are principles, standards, habits with respect to right or wrong conduct. So these are principles or values that guide our actions. Ethical decisions cannot be separated from the moral sensibilities that shape them, or isolated from the moral actors. So rules we choose to follow, principles we select, are in some part a reflection of our belief systems, our worldview, and eventually also of our character. So you cannot separate the actor from the action taken, okay? And we are the actors. The physicians are, speaking of the doctors, physicians are the actors here. So let's go back a little bit, even further back to the Greeks, because we're going to talk about the Hippocratic Oath, which is an integral part of the doctor-patient relationship. So we need to start all the way back to the Greeks. And Aristotle defined virtue as competence in the pursuit of excellence. Competence in the pursuit of excellence. For Aristotle, the virtuous man was principled. His ultimate telos or goal was to become a man of excellence, thereby attaining happiness. Does that ring a bell a little bit? If think back to our Declaration of Independence in our country. We talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's part of the Declaration of Independence. And this just shows that how Greek thought influenced our founding fathers. So, for Aristotle, again, the virtuous man was principled. His ultimate goal was to become a man of excellence, thereby attaining happiness. Happiness doesn't mean just being happy. Happiness means being fulfilled. Happiness resided in full human flourishing, was the chief good for man, and could be secured in whatever life was most satisfying. If you chose to become a carpenter, then you would want to be the very best carpenter that you could be. If you chose to become a doctor, you would want to be the best doctor that you could be, or an attorney, or whatever walk of life you choose. Man's virtue was linked with action. So virtue was acquired by doing virtuous acts, enhanced by repetition of virtuous acts. So this activity resulted in a virtuous disposition or a habit. The more that you repeat your virtuous acts, they become part of you, and they become a habit. So when you're presented with a situation similar, or maybe not exactly, but similar to a previous situation, you will respond in the same way because you have developed a habit. It's a habit based on virtue. Virtue and the virtuous person. The person practiced and adept at finding moral goodness in real situations were an intrinsic part of moral behavior for the ancient Greeks, for Aristotle. Then comes, many centuries later, comes Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, Saint Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was a monk and a philosopher. He was a religious man and a philosopher. He was a theologian of the 13th century, so this is many, many years after Aristotle. That happened about 300 years before Christ. He expanded on Aristotle's theory of morality. Purpose of virtue was to achieve happiness, just like Aristotle had said. Happiness was twofold. At one level, it was proportionate to man's nature and obtained by reason. Aquinas is very big on reason. Reason is very much part of the human person. So that part that was obtained by human reason was proportionate to man's abilities. At a higher level, man is directed to happiness beyond human nature, and that's to the knowledge of God. So Aquinas grounded his theory of morality in the natural law. So we're starting with virtue, the natural law, and so on. And you will see how we end up with natural law and the virtue when we look at something very practical, which are the ethical directives from the Catholic Church. Okay? All right. So natural law is the law of nature. The universe is organized with a purpose. Each individual part of nature has a goal in itself. All things to which people have a natural inclination, as apprehended by reason, again, reason, were considered to be good, like the preservation of life, the propagation of the species. The purpose of the natural law was to drive man to reach for the good and reject evil. This is all Aquinas' teaching. Because natural law, or moral law, it's another name for it, is based on human nature. Remember, in human nature, reason, appreciated through reason, human nature being the same everywhere, moral law is the same for all men, believers and non-believers. Aquinas declared that natural or moral law was morally binding and universal because it was grounded on reason, a quality possessed by all men. It doesn't mean that all men and women are reasonable, because some people do not practice reason. I know a friend of mine says that common sense is not very common. So Even though it is common sense, not very many people practice it. Since natural law was understood through reason, even those who do not believe ought to recognize their obligation to self and to others. As a Christian, Aquinas' teleology is based on theology. So his philosophy is based on theology because he was a theologian. He believed the purposeful organization of the universe was the work of the Creator God. And man's consummation rested on the reach for perfect happiness, his fulfillment that I talked about, which resided in the knowledge of God. So moral law provides an objective standard for right and wrong. Moral law should serve as a standard for the laws that are enacted by civil government. Civil law as well should be based on moral law, natural law. So this is the foundation of what we're going to be talking about today. Virtue and natural law. Let's get into medicine now. Going back, all the way back to the ancient Greeks again. We went from the ancient Greeks to Aquinas, and then we're back to the ancient Greeks because the medical tradition of the Western world, which is us, is traced to the ancient Greeks and the school of Hippocrates. The ancient Greek physician was both healer and executioner. Euthanasia was an accepted practice. You all know what euthanasia is. It's when the doctor kills the patient. You know, when we're speaking in medical terms. Not heals, but kills. The Hippocratic school, a small group of Greek physicians, about 400 years before Christ, before the birth of Christianity, initiated a change in this practice. So it's been around for quite a while, 2,500 years, 2,500 years. The school wrote what is called the Hippocratic Oath. The oath established a set of moral principles that were to guide the practice of medicine. The original oath of Hippocrates began with a covenant to the gods. Remember that these folks were pagans. Followed by duties and obligations to teacher and to patients. And ended with a promise not to break the oath under punishment of dishonor. The physician declared a covenant with his patient to do good and not to harm. That's beneficence and non-maleficence. And to always act in a just way to others, which is the principle of justice, or the virtue of justice, right? In time, the notion of the physician healer became the norm. From being healer and executioner, then the physician after Hippocrates became to be known as a healer, not as an executioner. The Hippocratic school introduced the concept of the practice of medicine as a moral commitment, a moral obligation of the physician to his patient. The physician made a covenant with his patient, with the gods as his witness. What is a covenant? Covenant is a type of contract, but a covenant is an alliance, a fiduciary relationship, a relationship of confidence and trust. A contract is a business-like agreement, but both are agreements between two persons or groups on doing something or not doing something. For the first time, there was a complete separation between curing and killing. With the Greeks, the distinction was made clear. The medical profession was to be dedicated to life. The practice of medicine became a transcendent moral activity. So, I have here, let me just pass this out so that you can all read with me. A statement. Did you pass this through? Yeah. Statement that I like to read and bring out to different groups because it's a statement that was made by Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead is a secular philosopher, anthropologist, very secular person. She is not a Christian, and yet she understood this change that had occurred with the ancient Greeks that was outlined in the Hippocratic Oath. And it reads the most, actually this was printed in the journal Psychiatry and Ethics by Dr. Maurice Levine, who was a psychiatrist several years ago, 1972. Personal communication between this lady, Margaret Mead, and Dr. Levine. It said, and she said, or he says, the most fascinating recent comment on the Hippocratic Oath is one which originated with Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist. Her major insight was that the Hippocratic Oath marked one of the turning points in the history of man. I'm reading from the journal. She says, for the first time in our tradition, Western tradition, there was a complete separation between killing and curing. Throughout the primitive world, the doctor and the sorcerer tended to be the same person. He with the power to kill had power to cure. He who had power to cure would necessarily also be able to kill. It was common, it was fairly common in ancient Greece that if there was an older person in a very wealthy family that was not even ill, but was just older, that the younger members of the family would go to the doctor for a draft. And this was a poison draft to give the old man so that the person would die and the younger people would inherit the wealth that was, the wealth of the family, but that was not coming to them until the individual died. So this was not an uncommon finding, in ancient Greece. One of the reasons why the Hippocratic Oath and the school of Hippocrates was so specific about this. Yeah. With the Greeks, says Margaret Mead, the distinction was made clear. One profession were to be dedicated completely to life under all circumstances, regardless of rank, age, or intellect. The life of a slave, the life of the emperor, the life of a foreign man, the life of a defective child. But society always is attempting to make the physician into a killer, to kill the defective child at birth, to leave the sleeping pills beside the bed of the cancer patient. And it's interesting that she ended her quote with that comment about how society is trying to make the doctor go back to the way it was before the Hippocratic Oath, before the Hippocratic tradition, and start going back to killing patients, not just healing and curing, but killing patients. I don't know if you're aware, but there is a growing interest in this country about this issue that's called physician-assisted suicide. They want to have the doctor assist the patients in killing themselves. And little by little, and maybe not so slowly, more and more states have legalized this process, this procedure. At this point, we have 6 states plus the District of Columbia where physician-assisted suicide is legal. So they're trying now to make the physician be part of killing the patient. That is totally against the Hippocratic tradition that said the physician cures and heals, does not kill. And the mouse is gone. So the relationship of the doctor to his patient became a relationship based on trust, okay? After Hippocrates, the patients could trust the doctor not to do them harm. Before they weren't sure, is this doctor going to heal me or is he going to cure me? Okay, so the practice of medicine is a moral endeavor. It's a moral enterprise. The practice of medicine is a moral endeavor, and 3 things about medicine as a human activity make it a moral enterprise. It's the nature of illness, the act of profession, the act of healing in the context of a professional oath. this is Dr. Pellegrino's theory of medicine. Dr. Pellegrino was because he's now passed on, he was a physician, internal medicine, bioethicist at Georgetown University. And he has done a lot of writing, and he is one of the big, the big names in bioethics, Pellegrino. The immediate goal of the physician-patient encounter is helping and healing. Through the science and art of medicine, the morality of the medical encounter includes moral intent, moral choice, and moral action. So your intention is moral. The choice that you make for whatever intervention you're doing for the patient is moral, and the action, therefore, will also be moral. What about the ends of medicine? The ends of medicine are simple: health, cure, and care. The ends of medicine are health, cure, and care. Virtues are essential for the medical encounter to benefit the patient. So that means that the physician or the healthcare person has to be a virtuous person. Professional virtue is that disposition or trait of character that enables the individual with excellence of intent and action to reach the goal of a specific professional activity. For every profession, there is a specific activity. For medicine, the activity is healing. Virtue that is practiced becomes a habit. Remember, that goes all the way back to Aristotle. We talked about that a few minutes ago. The more you practice a virtue, it becomes part of you. It becomes a habit, and you respond in a like manner to other situations. The virtues inherent to medical practice provide the physician with the habits that will lead him to choose the moral action. The virtues inherent to medical practice are a bunch of them: fidelity of trust. The doctor-patient relationship is based on trust. Benevolence. This virtue intends the good of the patient. You want what is good for the patient. Effacement of self-interest. The physician vows to service without self-interest. And sometimes you go beyond your own interest. Not just self-interest, but beyond your golden. I tell my students sometimes, just a little anecdote. It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You've been on all night before. You've been on call. And it's time for you to go home to your wife and kid. And Mrs. Jones comes into the clinic at 15 minutes before 5 o'clock with a 3-month-old baby with a fever. So what do? It's still time. The clinic isn't closed yet. The clinic closes at 5. But some people would say, the workup of a 3-month-old with fever takes time. It's laborious, and it takes time. It's going to go way beyond 5 o'clock, which is the time when the individual can take off and go home, and go home after being on call. But we're called not to do that, or to send the baby to the emergency room. We're called not to do that. We're called to take care of our patients, even if it means sacrifice for us. Compassion and caring. The physician feels the pain and suffering of the patient. Compassion means to feel with. So you feel with the patient. Intellectual honesty. Justice. The physician gives the patient the care and respect that he is due. And prudence. Prudence or practical wisdom. Deciding between alternatives in uncertain situations. Now, you could be a very virtuous person, but virtues, in order for your medical ethical decision-making to be just right or proper, these virtues must be linked with principles and with obligations. We have principles and we have obligations. A principle is a statement of moral truth used to guide behavior. The principles of beneficence, which is doing good, non-maleficence, not harming the patient, and justice, giving the due given the person what is due, represent obligations the physician owes his patient. These serve to guide the act that results in the good outcome. The underlying ethical principle is beneficence, the duty of assisting others in need and avoiding harm. This principle is expressed by the Hippocratic maxim, be of benefit and do not harm. Physician must act in the patient's best interest. Justice requires the physician to give the patient what is owed to him. The doctor-patient relationship is grounded on these obligations and depends on the virtues of the moral agent, or the physician in this case, or the healthcare worker. And these are the virtues that are inherent to medical practice. So medical ethical decision-making based on the virtues and obligations inherent to the doctor-patient encounter is concerned with, number one, the actor's behavior, the moral agent, with act and consequence and the outcome of the action. The physician and the patient come together in an act of trust and caring. The covenantal relationship of trust between physician and patient is maintained. Remember, this is a covenant, fiduciary. It's not exactly a business contract. So in sum, the ethics of medicine is the compendium of principles and obligations and virtues needed to achieve the ends of the profession. The internal morality of the doctor-patient encounter, faithful to the ends of medicine, which are health, care, and cure, will enable the physician to make the right choice with a good intention and result in the act that produces the very best consequence for the patient. The physician has a moral obligation to ground his judgments in a normative set of values and follow the principles that defend the best for the patient in the process that we call medical ethical decision making. Why don't we take a little break now for questions? We're talking about abstractions right now, but the next, right after this, we're going to talk about clinical ethics, and clinical ethics is a practical discipline. That's where the doctor-patient relationship comes up. But it's important that we understand these relationships between virtue and obligations and principles that we have as healthcare workers, people that deliver healthcare to patients, before we talk about the specifics of the doctor-patient relationship. Any questions? Virtue, obligations, very important.
You see that,
Professor Felipe, I have a question.
Go ahead.
The question that I have, how come in this time that we are living, the doctor oath was to cure, to care for the patient? How come right now, or what make the government to take that decision that the doctor has to assist a patient, that killing themselves? Why? What make them come up with that decision, since they already know that, the oath of a doctor is to cure, to care, the justice. I want to see the bottom of that.
Okay, Marina's question is what actually happened. Are there any events in the past history, in the past century, maybe a couple of centuries ago, that sort of hallmark where this started? How did this change when for so many centuries the physician was a healer, and now all of a sudden physicians are being considered to be killers, just like it was before the Hippocratic tradition?
Correct.
Right, and this comes up in a little bit later in our talk here today, but I will just give you a preview. There is an important focus right now on what was called patient autonomy. Patient autonomy was a consideration, had always been a consideration, but not with the intense focus that it is now, considered now. And in many people's minds, patient autonomy has become the prime mover in the doctor-patient relationship. So if a patient comes to you with a request to be killed, then the autonomous person's wish, many people believe, should be granted, and the doctor should, allow the patient to be killed or provide the means for the person to be killed. And this goes back to certain events that happened in the past century, and I will go into a little bit more detail, but it has to do with this concept of autonomy taken to the extreme. You will see how autonomy is not a bad thing in and of itself. It's important for people to feel that they can make decisions. That's part of our, it's important for our self-worth to be able to make decisions about ourselves and our health care and so on. But when it's taken to the extreme, things like these can happen. So I don't know if that answers your question completely, but you will see when we go into a bit more detail how all of this, how this took place. It was a gradual change, but how it took place going back all the way back to the beginnings of the 20th century.
Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Felipe, now this is Marina. Gladia was the previous question. It takes my attention that the vocabulary has changed lately about the physician now is called provider.
Yes.
And the patient is called client.
Yes.
So how's this been affecting?
This is also a consequence of not just exactly the autonomy issue is not really responsible for this, but there's been a change in the way that medicine is provided in this country. And I don't know that I can speak for the rest of the world, but I suspect that maybe Western Europe is the same. And I have, we're going to be talking about that as part of our talk today. So just, wait a few minutes and you'll see how my perspective about this is. And then, when we bring this up, then we'll open for questions again. Okay?
Thank you.
All right. Marina is right on. It's like she read my notes.
Yes, doctor, you say about that. We practice virtue become a habit.
If you practice virtue, then that virtue becomes a habit. The more you repeat that virtuous act, remember that virtue is action. Virtue is not just an abstract thought. You can think to be virtuous, but then you have to act on that virtue. The more you practice that virtuous act, then that virtuous act is the way that we respond to other situations. So it becomes a habit. So it, in a way, it kind of becomes part of our character. I don't know exactly if that's true, but it does become part of your worldview, I guess, at least, if not your character. So that if you're presented with a similar situation that has nothing to do with the previous one, that was the one that triggered you developing that habit, then you would respond in the same way that you responded before, because it's a habit now of yours. It becomes part of your worldview. Comes to mind the life issues. The life issues. If you are a promoter of life, then when you are presented with other situations, not necessarily just the killing of somebody else because you want their money, but abortion, for example, then you respond in the same way that you responded initially, because it's part of your worldview. You are a supporter, promoter of life. That's just an example. So that means that we as healthcare providers have to be virtuous people. What do you think about that? Do you think all docs, all nurses, all social workers, all all the folks that are healthcare are virtuous people?
No,
They're not. No, I don't think that we can say that. But that is what we should, that is our goal. That's our telos. We are to become virtuous people.
But normally when people say, "Oh, you are virtuous in certain things," no, all the virtues exist. It's part of the human.
Mm-hmm. Your virtues about certain issues, but not about others, you mean?
Yeah. Well, I think you're more like probably spiritual.
I guess you could, yeah.
But I don't remember any virtues right now, exactly which one are virtues. Probably a person who prays every day.
No, there's four that are called the four cardinal virtues, which go all the way back to the Greeks, and then there's the three theological virtues. The three theological virtues are hope,
Love and faith.
Okay.
Right, but what are the three theological? I'm sure you know that. You've heard this before. That's in 1 Corinthians 13, at the very end of 1 Corinthians 13, which is the love chapter. Yeah. Hope and charity. Yes. In charity or love. Yeah. St. Paul calls it love. So those are the theological virtues. But the cardinal virtues, which go all the way back to the Greeks, are prudence, justice, courage, and self-control.
So when you're talking about the virtues in the practice,
right?
You're talking about being a doctor, so you're talking about the cardinal virtues.
Talking about the cardinal virtues, not about the theological virtues. Correct? Yes.
But you need all of them to be a good.
But you need all of them because we don't. Yeah, at least.
You need to be prudent and you need to be
right.
whatever.
Yes, you need to. Right, you need to do that not just when you make a medical ethical decision. You need to have those virtues when you treat your next door neighbor, when you go to the supermarket and you go to pay the bill and you're in line to pay your bill. So, yes, these are just very sound advice from the old Greeks who were pagans. Those people were pretty smart, even though they didn't know the Lord. Okay, they didn't know the Lord didn't come until several centuries later. Okay, but remember that the Hebrew Christian tradition embraced Hippocrates completely, and the physician became a provider of life, of healing and curing, not of death, like it was before. But truly, of course, faith, hope, and charity, or faith, hope, and love, are the three theological virtues. And we as Christians, Catholic Christians, should have those virtues also. Yes.
I think that even those who are non-Christian, physicians that I've come across anyway, most of them who are non-Christians have the same. They have a faith in something, they hope for something, and they love as well. They just do it in a different way, but they're there. It's not faith in God, hope in God, love in God, but they have a faith of theirs.
Right. Yes, of course. Yeah, right. But,
That's what makes them good docs sometimes.
Okay. All right. You don't have to be a Catholic Christian to be a good doctor, which is what Dr. O'Sullivan says. Of course not. No, you don't. You don't have to. Okay. All right. Very good. Very good. So, every now and then I will stop for discussion, maybe, for some of the folks that are online and from you as well. All right. So let me take a drink and we'll go on. Now we're going to talk about clinical ethics. Again, for me, ethics, clinical ethics, when you're talking about the doctor-patient relationship, you cannot divorce the doctor from the patient because it's a dyad. They're together. So I will be talking about this, together. I know that you've already had a talk of the doctor-patient relationship from the doctor's point of view, but I just cannot separate one from the other. So you will see, as we talk along, you will see. Interrupt. We have a small group, so it's really nice. In a small group, you just interrupt when you have a question, and we'll stop and have a discussion. So now, clinical ethics. So clinical ethics is a practical discipline. It's practical discipline. It's problem solving. There is an ethical dilemma which demands a decision. The physician and the patient must make a moral choice. The physician or the health caregiver is a moral agent. Okay? Moral choice. We said already that the moral choices should be based on the natural law. Remember Aquinas and the natural law? We'll find that here on the directives from the Catholic Church. It is essential that the judgment be grounded on a set of values and an objective authority or principle that determines the morality of the action. Set of values, objective principles. We'll see how that comes in. So, medical ethical decision making. In this time and age, this time in our lives, and has been for several decades now, follows what is called the four principles approach. This four principles approach was proposed by philosophers Tom Beecham and James Childress. It's that gray book that I brought, a couple of books that if you are into books, you might want to get them. A lot of people don't buy books anymore. They go online for their information. But these are good reference books. Tom Beecham and James Childress. It's the ethical process most frequently applied in medical ethical decision-making today. Both Beecham and Childress are not physicians. They are PhD philosophers. I don't have anything against PhD philosophers, but they don't have the experience of an actual patient-doctor relationship because they're not physicians. They don't take care of people that way like we do. So the philosophers call it's a shame because I think bioethics, my opinion, I think bioethics should be the purview of the medical profession, at least clinical bioethics, that which deals with the doctor-patient relationship. But it is not so. Dr. Pellegrino, that I mentioned before, who talked about the ends of medicine and so on, was an MD. But the MDs that are in bioethics are very few. Most bioethicists are PhD folks that don't have the doctor-patient experience. And that, I think, is a handicap, I think. All right, so philosophers, these two gentlemen, call their protocol a principle-based common morality. Common morality is defined as a set of norms that all serious persons share. Let me read that again. Common morality is the set of norms or standards that all serious persons share. What is a serious person? It's up for grabs, isn't it? It's your definition or my definition of a serious person. The philosophers go on to say, I'm quoting from their book, that all persons serious about living a moral life grasp the core dimensions of morality. Again, what is a moral life? Sorry?
Can you repeat
the last statement?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They claim that all persons serious about living a moral life grasp the core dimensions of morality. These are these serious persons, which, see, serious persons are defined as those that follow the core dimensions of morality. They know not to lie, not to kill, or cause harm to innocent persons.
It's like integrity.
Integrity, okay.
Is more a serious person.
A serious person would, integrity means that that person would respond at the same way, pretty much the same way to most situations. And maybe going back to your question about how people have responded. The common morality in our culture is a morality that is based on, well, it's based on culture. And we know that culture changes year to year, month to month, sometimes day to day, it seems. So what is moral one day is not moral the next day. If our seriousness about our moral convictions depends on what the culture tells us, it's at least inconsistent. And I would say in some cases it's really wrong. What happened in 1973? Roe v. Wade, exactly. That's the law of the land in this country. Okay, that is the wrong law. That is incorrect. It's against the natural law. It's the killing of an innocent person in the mother's womb. So, but it's the law.
On the other hand, it has allowed many people to believe that that is okay because it's the law of the land, therefore it's okay.
Right. In fact, that is the way that our culture has of legitimizing the culture changes. they go to the judicial system to justify the culture changes. So they make a law, and once it is the law of the land, then people say, well, if it's the law of the land, then there's nothing I can do. Then we have to follow that. Like if you come to an intersection and the light is red, so what do? You stop when the light is red. You don't go until it turns green, right? That's the law of the land. But that's a good law, because you stop, because if you do go through the red light, you can cause yourself harm and maybe other people harm.
But that's the problem now. They teaching, for example, the nurses, they're teaching the nurses about I knew until family, normal family, extended family, nuclear family. Now exists the other kind of family, they create the homosexual. Now they talking about, he said, what? So they send a book and you have to teach the students about the new family.
The new family. I know. Yeah, that's one of the, right. That's one of the new laws. You mean same-sex marriage and same-sex attraction and so on. Right. And that, so that some of the more progressive schools are making that part of their curriculum, and they're teaching their students that there is a different kind of family, as opposed to the family that's made up of a man and a woman and the children. So, one of the questions that I like to ask of people is, so what do we do about that? Things are just happening so quickly, so very fast, that we develop a strategy, an argument against one of these things that come up, and before you start implementing it, another one comes up, and you're sort of divided. You just don't know what to do. Although we are called as Christians to stand for the truth, and we're Christian Catholics. And we stand for the truth. And the truth is really very well spelled out in our church doctrine. So if you stick to your church doctrine, and when you stand up in the public square and you stand up for the church doctrine, for your church doctrine, you're in the truth. And you're in the truth, and you do it with love and truth. It's a great combination. It works. It touches people. Doesn't touch everybody, but just one person that you touch, it's enough. That person will touch somebody else. That's all the Lord asks of us. You plant a seed, that seed will grow, and that person will touch another person, and that other person will touch another person. Who knows? Before you know it, you've touched 10 people instead of just one. So we don't keep quiet about these issues. We stand up and we tell the truth. I know that there is a risk to that, okay? We're diverging slightly from, but I think this is an important issue. There is a risk to that, because there are penalties that are incurred when a teacher at a nursing school decides or refuses to teach that a same-sex couple is the same as a natural family.
So you don't have to teach it. You don't have to teach that.
It's in the book.
That doesn't mean you have to teach it.
Well,
they're going to read in the book. So
That's okay. That's different.
they're going to read in the book. So
but what she's saying is that,
but
the teachers can be forced to do it. They can be coerced to do it.
well,
And
when I was teaching to the student, I said, okay, this is new for me. And I know, and I was clear. They said, I think it's his man and woman.
uh-huh.
So it was all the students. It was not teenagers, so
Right.
young. So
Well, these are nursing students that you're talking
nursing
about. Yeah,
students, nursing
right.
students.
These are young people, but they're not children. Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I told her, so now exists this.
But they will ask you, what do you think about the same-sex marriage, or the same-sex, same-sex couple? Is it the same as? And that's another issue that we could talk about it later. But there's many examples, many examples in the culture of people that have been penalized for standing for the truth. So that is a risk we take.
That's a risk.
It is a risk. So that's one of the virtues. We talked about the 4 virtues. Remember the 4 cardinal virtues? One of those 4 cardinal virtues was courage, right? Right. We have to be courageous.
I would like to share something with you.
Go ahead, Marina.
This is Claudia.
Who is it? Claudia. Okay.
Yes. My husband was teaching a class last week, the confirmation class. And there were students over there that he was sharing with me about what you just mentioned, that, the same sex of marriage. and my husband was telling them that, you know, let's see that the real life. Can you put two negative together and the light that right now that makes you see, or if you have a car and then you have a battery, can you put two negative or two positive together?
It doesn't work, right?
And then they said no. And then my husband told them that, you know, if you go back in Genesis, God created man and woman. So
Right.
therefore, two negative cannot work together. And then because of that, so a positive and the negative way, you know, we have light. This is the same way God put men and women to have you today. Without men and women today, you will not be present. And then he told me, the students said, oh, now I got it, mister, I got it. So I think that, you know, as you were saying that, you know, telling the truth, there is a consequence. We have to stand in what you believe. So spread the word right now to our kids, to our church members, to the kids that maybe in confirmation and communion, you know, and the community. From there, they will understand, you know, that issue more, or the virtue that the church is teaching.
Exactly. Very excellent. Excellent. Now, another way that you can approach that is the sacrament of marriage is binary. It's, you know, the individual's gift of themselves completely to the other. So this total, complete love. But it is also, the other part, it is open to life. So a same-sex couple is not open to life. So there's no way that they can fulfill that function because they're not open to life.
The thing, this is where when my husband touched that, and then they said, wow, they didn't see it like that, you know,
Right.
because you give them the reality that they are living so they can see it.
Exactly. Now, what he did is really very important. Claudia was your name, right? Claudia. What he?
Glardia.
Oh, Glardia. Oh, sorry, Glardia. What he did is really very important because he made it, you know, he spoke in terms that they would understand. He talked about you. You know, if you did not have a mom and a dad, you wouldn't be here today. And of course, the confirmation kids will understand that. If you talk in abstract terms and talk about philosophy and so on, like I did at the beginning, that's important because we need the background to understand the other. But when you're speaking to people, you don't speak about Aristotle and philosophy. You speak about themselves and their real life situations. Okay? Thank you very much for your question and your comment and contribution. And thank your husband also, please.
Thank you.
All right, so according to Beecham and Childress protocol, their protocol, moral medical decisions are based on the following 4 principles. And there they are on the screen. Respect for autonomy. It's a norm respecting the decision-making capacity of autonomous persons. Non-maleficence. It's a norm avoiding the causation of a harm. Beneficence. It's a group of norms for providing benefits and balancing benefits against risks and costs. And number 4 is justice, a group of norms for distributing benefits, risks, and costs fairly. This set of principles is thought to reflect the values of the common morality. Remember what common morality was? Common morality is defined as a set of norms that all serious persons share. Okay. All right.
The common morality is the autonomy of the person. That's why.
No, common morality speaks to the group, to the community.
But in general, what is happening in our society today is everybody has the autonomy to say whatever they need to say or think, and
right.
And what happened with that is in contraposition of justice, because if your autonomy is not justice, it's not
just
good.
Yeah, right. If your autonomy is, you know, incurs on being unjust to another person, for example, then you're not being just. You're just being what? Selfish is what you're being, right? Okay, we'll see about that, because that comes next when we talk about autonomy. So notice that the principles that are non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice go all the way back to Hippocrates. Those are part of the Hippocratic Oath. Principle number 1, which is respect for autonomy, was added on by these philosophers. Autonomy was added on by them. So these 4 principles are binding. This is now Beecham and Childress speaking, are binding unless they conflict with one another. That's a typical philosopher's comment. So they're binding unless they conflict with each other. That means they're binding, but they're not. Okay? This is typical philosopher ease, Principles in conflict, according to Beecham and Childress, provide an opportunity for compromise and negotiation. The conflict is settled by balancing the demands of one against the other and the consequences of either act. Then principles again are described by the philosophers as a reflection of the culture. These are the serious persons that they talk about, the culture. This makes principles subject to change with the culture. We live in a morally heterogeneous society without consensus of values. My values, your values. And now, in this age of relativism that we're living in, you have a value, I have a value, and they're both just as worthy, just as important, just as good. We know that's not true, because there are such things as absolute values, absolute truth. So we live in a morally heterogeneous society without a common view of human nature and what it takes to live a good life. So moral deliberation can become an inconsistent process, case-specific, dependent on the situation. That is not very good. What about the virtues that became habits and your worldview? Your worldview is just your worldview. But the bottom line here is then you just have to do whatever the culture wants you to do. All right? Okay. We know that doesn't work very well. Now, we're going to talk about the bad word, autonomy. Autonomy is not really a bad word. There's a lot of good things about autonomy, okay? Traditionally, the physician or the healthcare worker, but physician in this case, it's specific, had been considered actually the male physician, because it's paternalism, like a male, like a father, had been considered a type of father figure, because traditionally physicians were men, many, many years ago. Advocate for the patient, but a father figure. Like a well-meaning father, the physician directed the care of the patient. This is the paternalistic approach to the doctor-patient relationship. It's no longer the standard, which is not a bad thing in and of itself, because the patient should have a say in the choices they make for their medical care. Since the latter part of the past century, respect for individual autonomy has become the principal moral obligation of the physician. Respect for individual autonomy. Now, a bit of history. At the end of World War II, during the Nuremberg trials, remember World War II and the Nuremberg trials, the revelation of the human experiments perpetrated by the Nazi doctors on concentration camp inmates shook the Western world. The international medical community reacted with a forceful reassertion of the Hippocratic principles, but with a twist. Reference to God, that was the gods. Remember, they were pagan, but there was a reference to God. The gods were their witness to this oath. But the reference to God, now God with an uppercase G, was removed from the oath. But the principles of the Hippocratic Oath were kept. Some years later in the United States, the medical community also responded. There was a thing that's called the National Research Act of 1974 was enacted. The Belmont Report set ethical principles for the protection of human subjects of research. So the focus was human research and the individual who was part of the research. The report established 3 principles: respect for persons, autonomy, beneficence, and justice. This is when the autonomy issue started creeping up into our vernacular and into our culture and into the history. And the pendulum swung. Patient autonomy became the driving force in human subject research. Very quickly, very shortly after that, not just human subject research, but in the practice of medicine. Patient autonomy was #1 in the practice of medicine. That's why Beecham and Childers have autonomy as the #1 of the principles. And the Hippocratic principles are 2, 3, and 4, justice being the last. So the physician-patient relationship swung from an understanding of that relationship as one dominated by paternalism to a relationship dominated by patient autonomy. So it went like from one extreme to the other. And respect for individual autonomy became the principal moral obligation of the physician. Now, based on the Belmont report, the 4-principle approach became the method most frequently applied in clinical medical decision making. So notice the similarities between the Belmont report guidelines and the 4 principles. The 4 principles approach is based on the Belmont report.
Isn't it important to recognize that in human research, patient has to have autonomy?
Yes.
Because they have to be the ones that who the project is being done. For example, we all know about the problems with the Tuskegee experiments and syphilis. You know, that was done by us. That wasn't done by the Nazis.
Right, exactly.
And it was wrong.
It was wrong, yes.
It was very wrong.
Are you all aware of the Tuskegee problem that Dr. O'Sullivan is talking about?
In Guatemala?
No.
No, Tuskegee is in Alabama, yeah, right. You want to tell us about it?
People and treat the people.
The black men had syphilis.
Right.
And there were, they would not, even though penicillin had become available,
right,
they never treated them. They never told them the treatment was available, and they never treated them.
Correct.
And the whole idea was to see the course of syphilis, and
right,
it was black men. So there were
right,
2 things. There was the race issue, and there was the injustice of doing the same thing in some ways that the Nazis had done by withholding any kind of treatment or even letting them know that they had this treatment, that it was available and that they could have it.
Right, right.
It was so wrong, and we
right,
were so wrong for doing it. And it is one of the reasons when you deal with black patients, they do not trust you.
Right.
And you have to build up that relationship, and it's hard.
It is
to
difficult.
build up that relationship.
Correct.
And
yes.
I don't blame them. I don't blame them one iota. So I think that the Belmont report and all of the stuff that came out in terms of justice in human research was essential. What has happened is it's taken a different direction.
A different course, yes.
But I think that there's no patient, no human being should have any research done on them without their express consent.
Yes.
Full knowledge as much as you can about what you're doing, what it may happen, what the benefits are, what the risks are, what you don't know. I mean, and if we didn't have those things, that would not have happened. The things would have continued along the same way.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So I think that, we have to take into account, I know that a lot of things are attributed to the Belmont report, but the Belmont report was essential in order to protect human subjects in research.
Right, exactly, right. But because our focus is doctor-patient relationship,
yeah,
I just use it as a sort of a hallmark of how this came about. I mean, how that did not just stop with with human research, but it went beyond. You had a question or a comment?
So the Tuskegee experiment probably brought up the explicit need for informed consent.
Yeah.
And
yes.
the full education and all.
Exactly.
Possible.
And we will go over that. So there's some good things that happen, after the development of this notion of patient autonomy. And that's one of them. Yeah, right. In fact, just to elaborate a little bit on what Dr. O'Sullivan said, The Tuskegee program was a program that was started by the NIH, okay? It was not just any doctors, but it was the NIH, the federal government, National Institutes of Health. And it started in 1932, before the advent of penicillin. And they wanted to know what the natural history of syphilis was, natural history. So they collected a bunch of people who all had syphilis, and the reason for doing this initially was a good reason, because the treatment that was available at the time was so toxic that people sometimes died from the treatment and not from the syphilis. So they said, well, maybe we shouldn't treat them. There was no penicillin yet, remember that. And then, and this is in the 30s, that's before the war, before the Second War. Then after penicillin, that became available in the late 1940s. And it was found, found that it was just exactly what they needed to treat these patients. They did not use penicillin. They did not stop the study, but they continued the natural history to see what the natural history is until the 1970s. 30 years more of not using penicillin when they could have used it. So when you have a research program like this, and you find that a cure comes up, then what you do is you just stop the research program and you treat the patients.
Even when you're doing the research and you find it works, and you know significantly already before the project is finished it works, you stop and you treat.
Because we are, number one, our patients' advocates. We're not the advocates of the medical school that pays our salary. We're not the advocates of the pharma companies that support, the medications and stuff that you're using. We are the patient's advocate, number one. We're not even our own advocates. Remember that? We're supposed to treat our patients with supererogation. That's just a fancy term that means self-effacement, to the point of sacrifice, okay? And in this case, the Tuskegee case, the researchers totally ignored that. They totally ignored that. There's several other examples of that in that, I don't know.
Oh, so, the sterilization of
right.
mentally retarded Black women.
Well, some of them were not Black, but they were, yeah. And there was a case in New Jersey also, bless you, in a children's orphanage, and there was a problem with hepatitis. Hepatitis A, which is the common one, can go rampant in a place where there's a lot of people to put together, like an orphanage, kids. Children traditionally don't have the very best hygiene, so you can give it to the other kids and so on. So there's several examples, yeah, and that even happened later than the Tuskegee scandal. So these things have happened not just by the Nazis, but they happened right here, like Dr. O'Sullivan said. It's right here in this country, and we think we're so enlightened. We are not.
Don't we do prison experiments?
But sometimes, yeah.
It's almost impossible to do an experiment.
What we used to.
Yes.
Yes, at one time. I think before the Belmont report, but I think that changed with the Belmont
report. Well, there have been examples where prisoners have been used as subject research in Central America.
Yeah. In the United States, there are situations in which you can, but they are not medical research. You're not using drugs, you're not, it's a different kind of.
Right, but these protocols were implemented in Central America. I tend to remember Guatemala. But so these were Guatemala, Central American nationals that were not people from the United States. But the researchers and the farmers were from here. So you have to be careful with that, yes.
And they discovered that recently.
Yeah, not too long ago.
Because
yeah.
I know from the military side, okay?
Right.
And this is gonna sound really crazy, and I'm telling you there's document to prove that in San Francisco Harbor they actually released nerve agents to see what the impact would be.
Really?
They were really actually.
No kidding, I didn't know that.
They had diluted them.
Uh-huh.
They wanted to see what a diluted version would be, because at that time we were having riots and things of that nature.
Uh-huh.
They just wanted to make people sick, so they couldn't riot. So they took out these diluted drums and they actually made a mist,
And it was like biological
This is
agents,
biological agents.
so they would get sick.
Not biological, it's actually chemical agent.
Chemical. I don't.
This is in the late
I don't-
60s, early 70s.
I had no idea
It had
that.
been declassified when I read the report.
Really, my
But
goodness.
it's not only in the medical issue. They FDA know that Roundup is making the person sick, and they are applying.
FDA knows what's making a patient sick?
Roundup,
It's
the weed killer,
Weed killer, oh.
Oh,
and it's you can buy in Home Depot.
Roundup, you mean? No, you can't anymore.
Yeah,
No, you're not supposed, it's illegal.
well, it's now in
Okay,
Home
but it's
Depot.
illegal.
It's in Home Depot. I just buy some.
well, surprise, surprise.
Why are you buying it?
People do illegal things all the time.
They don't say to the people, this can cause cancer or this can cause this. They sell it.
Use hot shots, any of these.
You have to have a license for the use of it.
Okay, the like hot shots and stuff you get over the counter. You look at the ingredients, you have the primary ingredients for chemical agents. And example is like, if you notice it's like an oil. The reason for that oil is so that the chemical agent actually sticks to the surface.
Okay.
And I mean, it's nasty. I do a bit of research.
All right. So
I may be wrong, maybe I'm confusing Europe and the United States, but I know that in one of the two areas, Roundup is no longer allowed.
Europe is a lot more strict about insecticides than we are.
In only in the wine that comes from California, you are drinking Roundup.
Yes, but that,
Okay.
Yeah,
think
like
they're
that,
trying
that you are drinking.
but you have to realize they used it at a time that they did not understand that. Now they understand.
No, right now.
Well, that's like I said.
It's a like a.
All those vineyards burned down, so we don't have to worry about that
Oh,
anymore.
no.
Don't drink
They didn't all burn down.
wine.
Yeah. You know that I was there. I was in Calistoga a couple of days because I have children that live in Northern California, and I was visiting right at the time of the fires. Yeah. All right. Let's go on with autonomy. So, respect for autonomy may be defined as respect for the individual's right to self-determination. So it's not a bad thing. It's when you take it to extremes that it becomes a bad thing. Self-determination requires two conditions: freedom to exercise the free will and the capacity of moral agency. In other words, are you capable of making a decision? And you have your own freedom of your will to choose one or the other. Make your choice. It is the principle that recognizes that human beings can make reasonable choices of their own that differ from the choices of others. The human being is in part defined by the use of reason. Remember Aquinas way back? The violation of the principle of self-determination harms the individual's human nature. Human nature, reason, violates the natural law. So violating this principle, you violate the natural law, which is the moral law. So it's not a moral thing to ignore completely the patient's right of self-determination. So respect for the patient's self-determination is essential for a healthy doctor-patient encounter. The autonomy movement, which I call that, but some people don't, elicited an apparent conflict between the principles of beneficence and the self-determination, making beneficence synonymous with paternalism. Some people claim that if you practice beneficence, you were telling the individual patient to do something, maybe even coercive, imposing your will, like it happened with paternalism. The father figure told the kid and the child happened to be a 30-year-old patient, so he was not a child, but this is what you need to do, and the 30-year-old patient just kept quiet and did it. Paternalism, which is not a good thing. Patients should have a voice. They should have a way to interact with the medical team or the physician in their health care. So paternalism restricts the freedom of the person, presumes that the patient cannot make intelligent decisions. So the physician makes the choice for the patient. Beneficence seeks the good of the patient, what is medically good, what is good in terms of the patient's perceptions, what is good for human beings as members of the community, what is good for the person or the patient as a spiritual being. The human cannot flourish without the freedom and the capacity to make choices and develop a life plan that's necessary for us to flourish, to go reach that happiness that Aristotle was talking about, all the way to being fulfilled, completely fulfilled. The principle of beneficence will promote and support the patient's self-governance. Beneficence and respect for a person's autonomy are in accord. They're not against or in conflict with beneficence. So they're in accord. Although the patient is the person in need. Who is the person in need in the doctor-patient relationship? It's the patient. The patient is the weaker of the two. You are the physician, you have the knowledge, you have the status, and all of that. The patient is weak because he is in need of care, because he's ill, or is seeking advice, and so on. So the patient is the weaker of the two in that relationship. But it is the patient who has the responsibility to establish the relationship. It's the person, it's the patient, the person who chooses. Patient preferences are reflected in the choices people make. So patient preferences are very important when facing a health problem or a medical treatment. The ability to express preferences and have others respect them is crucial to a sense of personal worth. Your personal worth is established, it's promoted when you feel that you can make decisions. Patient preferences are recognized by the legal system. So it's not just us, physician and patient, but the legal system, the lawyers, the legal system, the judicial system recognizes this as a fundamental right. Each person has a right to control his or her own body and the right to be protected from unwanted intrusion. Okay? So a patient can refuse the treatment, can refuse an intrusion, and is protected by the law. So physicians have preferences too, don't they? Yes, they do. Their preferences are expressed to the patient by making recommendations regarding an appropriate course of care. They express their preferences. Patients express their preference to the physician by stating that their desire to be cared for, their acceptance of the recommendations, and their hopes of satisfactory results. In general, the influence of the principle of autonomy has been generally positive, So it's not a bad thing. It's only, again, when it's taken to the extremes that it can become a bad thing. Respect of the individual's values promotes self-worth, sustains the integrity of the human being. Respect for autonomy has helped to increase the patient's self-determination. Pride in being who you are, ability to choose and retain control over important decisions that has served to counteract the paternalism of traditional medicine. So we come to a balance between the two, The authority of patients' preferences, however, is not unlimited. All right? The authority of patients' preferences is not unlimited. The respect for autonomy obligates the physician to respect the patient's preferences and comply only if they do not conflict with the goals of medicine. What are the goals of medicine? I've said that too many times already. Health, care, and cure, right? It's healing. So if the patient is requesting something that is not in line with the goals of medicine, then the physician is not required to do as the patient asks, to agree, okay? Now, you brought up positive results. We said that the influence has been generally positive. One of the positive results is informed consent. Informed consent was not available before. It wasn't even talked to. I remember when I went to medical school, which was 100 years ago, people didn't talk about informed consent. It wasn't even taught in medical school. It is now, but it wasn't then. Informed consent is a practical, positive manifestation of respect for autonomy in the doctor-patient encounter. Physician makes the diagnosis, recommends treatment, explains the benefits and risks to the patient in appropriate language so the individual understands, of course. Patient understands the information and accepts the proposed therapy. The encounter is characterized by, number one, good communication, mutual respect, shared decision making. Let me repeat that again, shared decision making. The individual, the patient, has a say in the treatment that the doctor is proposing. The individual can ask questions, can say, do we do it this way? Can we do it that way? It would be more convenient because I'm a single mother, or etc. All right, disclosure to the patient should be in understandable language, should include the risks and benefits of the available treatment plans and the physician's recommendation based on the doctor's clinical judgment. An adult patient has a capacity to consent or to refuse, not so kids, but an adult patient has the capacity to consent or to refuse after being well informed, okay? Refusal of care by a competent and informed adult should be respected, even if that refusal leads to serious harm to the individual. Courts have upheld the legal right of adult Jehovah's Witness patients, adults, to refuse life-saving blood transfusions. And in some cases, the individual has died because they did not receive the blood transfusion. But the courts have upheld this. The individual adult has the right to do that. If it happens to be a child, then the laws are different in children, because children cannot consent or refuse what pediatricians usually do if they're presented with a case such as this, that the parents refuse a blood transfusion for the child. They go to the judge, they go to the court and get a court order. And that makes the physicians responsible for that part of the treatment, and they give the blood transfusion. And this, in some cases, is a relief to the adult patient, to the adult, to the parent, in this case, of the child, in the family of a Jehovah's Witness family, because that takes the responsibility of allowing the blood transfusion from the parent, from the adult, and it's given then to the physician or the court or the judge. Okay. So in a way that works. Another practical manifestation of the state of the patient's self-determination is reflected in the statements of individual choice that patients are encouraged to make in advance of serious disease or disability. These are the so-called advanced directives. Does everybody have a clear idea of what the advanced directives are? You do?
No.
Do not, okay. An advanced directive, there's different kinds of advanced directives. The common advanced directive, or the one that people use more frequently, is probably the one that you should not use. Have you ever heard of POLST, P-O-L-S-T? Okay, yes. All right. Well, the people in medicine, both of you ladies are nurses, right?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, POLST is a new form that came out of the West, one of the Western states, Oregon, which is one of the more progressive states, and one of the first state in the country that legalized physician-assisted suicide in the 1990s. Much earlier than any of the other states. Okay. POLST is just an example, but an advanced directive is a form. It's an actual form. There's a form, piece of paper with boxes to check, where people check what they want to be done to them in case where they are disabled or sick enough or maybe unconscious, and they cannot have a decision. They cannot make a viable decision. So in those, people, you can check, I don't want IV fluids if I'm like this. I don't want to be fed and given water and nutrition, fluids and nutrition. I don't want to be resuscitated with chest compressions. I don't want to use chemicals to promote the heartbeat and improve the blood pressure, etc. You can be as specific as you want. But a lot of people were doing these advanced directives when they were in their 40s. People when they're 40 years old don't think about dying, not quite yet. So when the situation comes up many years later, 20, 30 years later, and the individual is faced with a situation that they cannot make a decision, then these guidelines that they decided were what they wanted to do at age 40 may not be exactly what they want to do at age 60. Maybe the 60-year-old person will say, yeah, do CPR, and do resuscitation. When you're 40, that is just so far away in your thought process that you may not even think, you may not think that you would want to do that. So recently in most places, most people, especially our church, we recommend not to use this kind of advanced directive because of the reasons that I already outlined. And post is one of these. The problem with post is even worse because post is done by a non-medical professional most frequently or very frequently. The post is done usually by a technician or administrative person. When people get admitted to hospital, they have the form and they go through a checklist. And that person, the patient receives no counseling, no explanation of any of the, and it's done, very quickly as the patient is being admitted to hospital. So post is a very bad idea. And the CMA, I'm part of the Catholic Medical Association. And the CMA is very actively working in our state. Our state CMA is very actively working against post. However, what do we as a CMA recommend? What does our church recommend? Our church recommends that the patient designate a surrogate decision maker. And that's also an advanced directive because you can do that when you're 40, and then it's a good idea to designate more than one person because if you're doing it at an early age, if you designate one person, that person might have a car crash or car wreck and die or something. So it's a good idea to designate two people, like a number 1 and a number 2, but designate a person that is either a family member, but it doesn't have to be a family member. It could be somebody that knows you well, knows what your likes and dislikes are, knows what your worldview is and how you would respond to situations one way or the other. And that person will be made responsible for making medical, ethical decisions when you're not able to do that because you're incapacitated or unconscious or in a situation where you can't make your own decisions. That is the best way to do an advanced directive. And I think that you should all do that. I have an advanced directive, and the person who is my surrogate is my son. Because I know that Philip knows how I feel about things, and he will act about my issues the same way that I would.
So we don't need to use the post.
You do not need to use the post. No. Now, you will be presented in the medical setting, in the hospital setting. They will ask you as you get in to be registered as a patient, do you have an advanced directive? That's one of the questions that people are asked. And you say no, then they pull out the post form and they fill out the post form. So what you need to do is you need to have a designated surrogate before you go to hospital. And when you go be admitted, you have that form. And they ask you, I did that just recently because I had a hernia operation in June. And do you have an advanced directive? Yes, I do. I have a surrogate designated and so on. You present the surrogate, they make a photocopy and they put it in the chart. Well, it's in the electronic medical record now.
That's a designated surrogate. You have to specify exactly what
you have to, no, you designate a person, a surrogate. You do not designate specifics. No. You designate a person. So that means that you have to choose that person very carefully. You can't just get anybody. You need to have somebody that really knows you very well, knows what your worldview is about life and death issues and so on, end of life situations.
But to avoid the post, because you have your designated person,
right?
And it's going to come to time you're going to see or any person, and
right?
The person is going past years. Said that knowledge, and they're going to get put in the post, and he's a surrogate.
No. If you've designated a surrogate, then the post is not used. What is used is your designated surrogate as your advanced directive, not post.
But you can also come up with an advanced directive that's not post, that you can work out with a lawyer.
You can.
And if it specifically says what you want at that point that you make it.
Right.
And you change it periodically as you need or you think you need to. So that at least your surrogate, no matter how well they know you, there are sometimes things that you never discuss.
True. Life is not perfect. No, not at all. No.
I think it's a two-edged sword. I mean,
right.
I think that the person themselves should have some document that says what they would like or not like.
Right.
That document needs to be reviewed every few years because your healthcare changes, you change, like you said. But I think also the surrogate, no matter how close your surrogate is, they may not really understand that well.
True.
And they have
That's very
own,
true.
They too have their own personal desires.
Yes.
And so that might get in the way of them making a proper decision.
Right. Yes,
and not respecting what you documented that you would really want.
Right. And you mentioned, making it a legal document by going to an attorney for a legal power of attorney for healthcare. That a lot of people do that, but it's not really necessary. You can write it out yourself. You have to sign it, and you have to date it, and get one person, preferably two, to witness that it is true indeed the signature of the person. But that it does, and that is just as valid as if you went to an attorney, because you go to an attorney and it costs money to do that. You don't need to do that. You don't need to do
get notarized to be on the safe side.
that. You could, but it's not necessary to get it notarized either. So,
Doctor,
yes.
We also can follow Catholic directive. If you don't want to specify, you just can write.
Yes, you can do that. Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that, and then people would be referred to this, to the directives, right? Yes, you can do that. But the important thing, I think, is that you need to do this before the situation comes up. Because if you don't, then you're going to be forced on something like post, and you don't want to do that.
What happened with old people right now? So, I have my ideas. I would like to teach the people in my church.
Okay.
I was thinking about the post, and it's good that you mentioned right now. And then I say, what I want to do is explain exactly what this means. No intravenous, no this irritation, because like you say, that's what they do. They just say, okay, you have to figure this out. You don't have to solve the doctor, but you have to mark the box. So, but this if I had a chance to do that, just offer other things and not just a paper, then.
Right.
So they can be created on paper, more easy or more specified.
It could be just a plain piece of paper, and you use just a plain piece of blank paper, and you fill it out, like we said, and you sign it and date it and witness it, and that's all. It doesn't have to be anything special.
Right, but that paper is the part of the.
No, pero es que son varias formas. Esa, la que dice el doctor, es una de todas las formas que nos vienen.
It's just one of the forms, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then when you have this, like whether it has a leak, whether you've gone to an attorney or not, then this is your advance directive. So when you go in the hospital, or even if you don't go in the hospital, you have it, then you have it. It's part of what you have. It's part of your documents. But when you go in the hospital, I said go in the hospital because a lot of the post is usually given as people get in are going to be admitted. Do you have an advance directive? No, I don't. Here's post. And that is what you have to be sure to be able to avoid. And you avoid that by saying, yes, I have an advance directive. Here it is. And you show them that, and that's the one that is used. So you can tell, the folks at your church.
You also don't have to fill out the form that they give you.
You don't.
Right, but normally when the people go to
but most people, what do you think most people do? Sign here. How many, when you go in the hospital, you're given like 15 forms, and you check here, check in the box, and sign down here. Check it. What do people do? They check in the box, and do they read that form? They do not. People don't read those forms because there's like 20 of them. So you have to be careful what you're signing, and you obviate the situation by having your own form right there. Designate a surrogate. I recommend that to anybody, no matter how old you are. You can be old like me or you can be young. It's important to have a designated surrogate.
That is true. That's a happy.
Yeah, right.
Everyone wants to do fast.
Or maybe two, like I said before, in case that one person has an accident and is not available, then some people say, well, you should designate two people instead of one. Some people say, don't designate your spouse. They do. And the reason is because if it's in a hospital setting, the spouse is so involved with the critical care of the patient and so on, that they may not be able to make a good decision. So it may be better to have the surrogate be someone else, close, but not necessarily your spouse. But the initial inclination for most people, oh, my wife would be that. But it's probably not a good idea to place that responsibility on your wife. She's going to have a whole lot of problems on her shoulders if you're in the hospital in the ICU on a ventilator or something like that. Yeah.
It has to be a clear mind.
Yes. All right. Okay. So, what about extreme practice? These are the good things about this autonomy movement. So there's good things that happen because of the autonomy, but there's bad things that happen with the autonomy movement as well. And I brought this short article that I'm not going to read the whole article to you, but this is an article that was in the New England Journal of Medicine several years ago. And interestingly enough, it was republished this year again, 2017. It was written by Ezekiel Emanuel. I don't know if you know that name. Ezekiel Emanuel is described as one of the architects of Obamacare, of the Affordable Care Act. He is the brother of Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff of Obama when Rahm Emanuel is now the mayor of Chicago. So Ezekiel Emanuel is a doctor. He's a physician. He's not a PhD philosopher. I think he's OBGYN. And he is also has a PhD. And he compares, the title is Physicians Not Conscripts, Conscientious Objection in Healthcare. And there is such a thing as conscientious objection, and that has been practiced in our country and in other countries when there was a draft, for example, that an individual was drafted to go to war, and the person was of a religious persuasion or maybe of moral conviction. That person decided that he was not going to pick up arms against a fellow human being. So he objected to that role. So he was a conscientious objector. And that's why the title is Physicians Not Conscripts. So conscientious objection laws give healthcare professionals the legal right to refuse, on the basis of personal beliefs, to perform certain procedures or care for particular patients. The authors argue, there's another person, including Emanuel, who is the author of this article. Emanuel is now at University of Pennsylvania Medical School. They're both academics. The authors argue that professional societies should declare conscientious objection unethical. And he goes on to say that physicians that would not agree to go along with whatever the culture decides is what is ethical should not be in medicine. So he would actually bar people from going to medicine if you have moral convictions about abortion, for example. If you're pro-life, then you should not be in medicine. A lot of people think that. That's very dangerous. That takes away your freedom of conscience. Okay, that's not just docs, that's nurses too. There are many examples of nurses that have been penalized for not wanting to go into the OR or to wherever place they do the abortion to assist in an abortion because their conviction is that they are not to be complicit with that at all. So they don't go in to assist in an abortion. And they get demoted, they get fired, they get charges against them and so on because it's the law. And because it's the law, it's protected by the legal judicial system.
What about the law Bush approved about the conscience?
Yeah, well, at this point, there is a law protection you're right, the Bush law. You're right. There is. But the hospitals frequently find ways of penalizing the folks that stand for the truth. And you have to go See, when this kind of accusation is made, then you have a chance to win, if there's a suit, because the law protects you, like you said. But that means that you have to go to court, pay legal fees, and it takes months and months and months and months to drag this out. And during this time, you're not getting any money because you're not being paid. So most people just don't go through this. So that's our system. Like it or not, it's our system. At least you have a recourse. You can actually go and do this. In other countries, you don't. You do it or you get out in other countries. But at least here you have that recourse. So, and it's not just this article in the New England Journal. I belong to the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's the organization that I belong to. And your specialty is OBGYN, Dr. O'Sullivan? Do you belong to ACOG?
No.
You do? Okay. ACOG is one of the...
I know.
Well, I'm going to say it anyway. ACOG is one of the most virulent promoters of abortion in the country.
How is it?
Yes.
Eight?
ACOG, American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. I belong to the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics. The American Academy of Pediatrics doesn't promote abortion, but the American Academy of Pediatrics has policy statements that tell their kids, tell the pediatricians to send their kids to Planned Parenthood for advice. How do you like that? Planned Parenthood clinics for advice. And there's a policy statement from the AAP that says that if you're in medicine, there's no reason why you shouldn't, they're actually the same thing that Ezekiel said. You should not be in medicine if you don't want to do something that a patient asks and is permissible by law. It's in a policy statement. It's not binding. Policy statements is not a law, but it's a policy statement that comes from an organization that has a lot of weight. Even patients find out about that. Sometimes patients say, "Are you a fellow of the Academy of Pediatrics? And do you sign after your name FAAP after the MD?" Some people ask that, not many, but some people do. So these academies or colleges have influence, or they can influence. So it is a strange new world that we're living in. Yeah. And we need to stand for the truth with courage and prudence, especially courage and justice, and self-control. Self-control, we're not going to go out and insult people. We just very gently tell the truth. Where? Right here. In your church. In your family. To your neighbor. In the public square. That's really hard to do. Because it's nice, it's easy to speak about these things because you all think pretty much the same as I do. But what about if you're talking to a group of secular people that don't even believe in God? You still should do the same. That's where your courage has to be even really very strong, because they're going to throw tomatoes at you or spit on your face or actually physically be aggressive. Usually not. Usually they just insult you. I am at University of Miami. I do some work there, not much. I'm very, very part-time in the Institute for Bioethics. And in some of my relationships there, and maybe sometimes even in meetings, I've had people say things to me that I have answered when I could, and other times when it was just a sort of a subtle insult, I just choose not to answer when that happens. Because, that just starts controversy when you do that. But it's happened to me. I know what you think, one lady once told me. That time I just couldn't hold myself. And I said, "You really know what I think? So you have ESP and you can read my mind?" I did say that. And the other people, everybody laughed because it sounded kind of funny, So it sort of like diffused the situation a little bit when I said that. I regretted saying it because I was being, being against like promoting controversy. And you don't want to promote controversy. You want to stand with the truth. Like before we said about, what to tell people when they say, that a same-sex marriage is a marriage. It is not a marriage. It's just like Glaudia's husband said very clearly. It is not a marriage, because a marriage is binary. Marriage has giving of yourself completely to the other person, your inner self completely to the other person, to the point of self-effacement, just like the Lord Jesus. He died on the cross for our sins. That is just the most extreme example of love. That is how you should love your spouse. And you should be open to life. Same-sex couples cannot be open to life. The anatomy doesn't allow that. Okay?
Oh, that's a good point.
The anatomy doesn't allow that. Okay, all right. So, Ezekiel, Emmanuel. Remember these names, because they're going to come up. You're going to see them. Emmanuel is interviewed by people on television a lot. Usually about the Affordable Care Act, about Obamacare, not about these things. He was the one that was many years ago, several years ago, was interviewed, and because he was the one that was accused of being the author of the death panels. Remember the death panels that they were talking about? That was part of, and then they removed that part from the Affordable Care Act. The death panels were people that of a certain age and above 65, I think it was, were to be counseled that they had a choice to kill themselves. If they did have a significant illness, one that had a certain morbidity and some mortality, they could either be treated, or they had a choice to ask the doctor to kill them. And that was part of the ACA, of the ACA, or better known as Obamacare. But that's been taken off. That's been removed. I understand. I haven't read those 12,000 pages of Obamacare.
They took out the vulnerable people. It was they put like LGBTI, that the vulnerable. They took this, or this still continue.
VVTI.
Lesbian,
Sorry, gay.
Yeah, because I had some conference. They start about the Affordable Care Act. And
What did they take out?
They took the LGBTI, because normally the vulnerable people was children, women.
I still don't know what you said they took out.
Oh, LGBT, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Do you know
They took it out of?
Yeah.
No, LGBT is a designation that is covered in.
No, but it's still that because it doesn't exist like a vulnerable people. They put in.
Oh, they pulled them as
like
a
vulnerable people.
vulnerable part of the population, a vulnerable. I don't know that. Don't know the answer to that. But LGBT people, and it should be. LGBT folks should get care just like anyone else. Yeah, certainly should. They should. It's some of their actions that we object to, not to that. Remember that we love the sinner. We hate the sin, but we love the sinner. The sinners are entitled to our love. And they should get, all that anyone else gets, including health care. Right.
Doctor, I don't know if you are gonna do the post.
What?
Ahora se me olvidó en español, que se va a hacer como una pausa para...
Oh, you want a break? Yeah, it is.
A break.
It's 11 o'clock, isn't it? Yeah, it's 11. Yeah, let's take a break. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me
Sorry about that.
No,
I get carried away. I'm sorry. We're on break now, okay? Take a break.
15 minutes.
Break.
Okay, thank you.
What's that? All right. Now we're going to talk a little bit about, is everybody back? Yes. Yeah. About the new professionalism. And it would be an answer to a question that came up, or a comment that came up from the group. So how has this affected the doctor-patient relationship with this new professionalism? Yeah. The past several decades in the United States, and also in Europe, but more so here, the practice of medicine has undergone significant transformation. Astonishing gains in medical knowledge, sophisticated technology. The technology is just going out of bounds sometimes. They have modified the practice and markedly increased the demands of the patient population on the profession. The more that is available, and you can see that, online, on television, You see those commercials for drugs, ask your doctor if you should take this and such medication. The other day I was watching the news, and you know how they break the news and they have commercials in the middle, and they had 5 commercials. 4 were for drugs. 4 were for medications. And they list all these complications, including death at the end, death. And then ask your doctor if you should take this medicine and maybe die, I guess. I don't know.
Well, my personal favorite one is pregnant women should not handle this medication. that tells you.
It tells you something about about the medicine, right. So what has happened then? A healthcare industry has developed. There was no such thing before, 50 years ago. This is an industry, healthcare industry. The physician was encouraged to join the marketplace. The physician became a medical practitioner. The patient became his client. The practitioner sold a product, which was medical care, to the client, who was the patient. In many ways, the morally based interaction between patient and physician, based on trust, remember this was a covenant, was replaced by a relationship between provider of a service and client. So from covenant, it came to contract, which is like a business-like agreement. The relationship went from covenant to contract. This transformation of the doctor-patient interaction has altered the doctor-patient relationship. The consequence has been a rising distrust of the public for the profession and the ever more powerful healthcare industry. The healthcare industry has become the enemy, So, classically, this doesn't want to respond sometimes. Let me try the mouse. Like that. Okay. It does. So, classically, a profession was identified by the requirements of extensive study, a pledge to labor for the benefit of others, and a code of ethics, right? Professions were, and that applies to the legal profession as well, Extensive study, you have to study for these many years. You pledge to labor for the benefit of others. You are in a service situation where you give service to others, and you have a code of ethics. A new code of ethics that's called medical professionalism in the new millennium, a physician charter. This is not so new. It was redacted by which one? It was in the Annals of Internal Medicine in 2002, which is a while back, 15 years ago. And this statement that was published in this journal declared the fundamental principles of physician professionalism to be, number 1, the primacy of patient care, patient autonomy, and social justice. Since publication in 2002, the Charter has been endorsed by many more than 150 organizations and approved by most American medical specialties. Many medical schools have embraced and adopted the guidelines, so it's being taught in the medical schools. In the case of social justice, just think about that one. Patient autonomy we've already discussed. And the primacy of patient care is implicit. That's what we do. We take care of patients. But what about social justice? This is a new one. It's an ethical obligation to society. So they claim the Charter states that the physician must work toward the fair distribution of healthcare resources. So the physician would no longer be the individual patient's advocate, but must be responsive to the healthcare of society. The obligation to the fair distribution of healthcare resources competes with the fiduciary obligation of the physician to his patient. So we're no longer responsible to this person, the doctor-patient relationship. It's one patient or one family. Now we're also responsible for the society, the health of the society. The Charter has become the new code of ethics for the medical profession, essentially replacing the Hippocratic tradition. As I tell my medical students, there are basic considerations one must take into account when making an ethical medical decision. And these are medical indications. Are there clear indications for the intervention? If a patient is coming to you with a sore throat and you do a rapid strep test and you document that it is strep throat, then you need to intervene. Is there indication to intervene? Yes. Is there some way that you can intervene? Yes, there is. We can treat this with penicillin, which is an available antibiotic. So there are medical indications. You intervene and you help the patient. Medical indications, patient preferences. The patient is a 10-year-old child. The 10-year-old child is given the choices of an injection of bicillin, which is very painful, or 10 days of oral penicillin. What do you think the child would prefer? He would prefer the medication by mouth, right, than the painful shot. However, the mother tells you that she has a job and the kids are taken care of by different people during the day, and that she's unsure of compliance. So in that case, then the best for the kid is not the oral medication, but the shot. And you give them the shot. So patient preferences, okay? And then patient preferences, if they conflict with the ends of medicine, which are healthcare and cure, then we don't have to go with the patient's preferences. Quality of life. Are we improving the quality of life of this 10-year-old? Yes, we are. The sore throat will go away. So he will be feeling much better. The quality of life will be improved. And allocation of resources. That's number 4. And there's a reason why this is number 4. Allocation of resources is number 4 because you do not do allocation of resources at the bedside or in the clinic, face-to-face with a patient. Allocation of resources is a determination that is made in the committee room, in the conference room, apart from your individual doctor-patient encounter. Don't talk about allocation of resources at that time. So you see how the new charter has included allocation of resources, social justice as a principle to follow. The life of the physician or the healthcare worker has been made much more complicated since the new millennium, since this new charter, since this change in the doctor-patient relationship from covenant to contract. And I'm not even considering all the paperwork that has to be done nowadays with the healthcare plans and with the electronic medical record. I don't even want to go to that. Fortunately for Dr. O'Sullivan and for myself, we don't have to deal with that because we're not in patient care anymore. But the electronic medical record is a big, big headache that is interfering in the doctor-patient relationship. Patients are not, you're aware of what this is, the electronic medical record? Mm-hmm. Yeah, patients don't have charts anymore like before, okay? When I was toward the end of my time in practice, that was when this was being introduced. And we were working with it and so on, and it was it's a lot easier now because the technology is better. But it's a distraction. Patients are complaining that when you go see your doctor, the doctor is talking to the computer and not even crossing eyes with the patient. Do you do eye contact with your patient? No, I'm looking at the computer because I'm doing this on the computer, and you're not even doing eye contact with your patient. Patients have noticed this. Patients don't like this. Patients are complaining about this. And with reason. This is a very important, our relationship is one of trust. You're talking about very personal things with this person who is in need of your services. Sometimes, things that they're telling you that they don't tell anyone else, Well,
one time I went to the doctor, he was, here is your prescription, goodbye. He said, you didn't take the temperature to me. So, how you are giving me a medicine that you don't know? Oh, well, it's in your chart. Well, goodbye. It's the last time that you see.
You told them?
Oh, yeah.
Good for you.
Yeah, because if I have a question, no, here is your prescription, goodbye.
Yeah. It's not necessarily like that all the time, but it frequently is like that. You have to, and you have to understand the individual, the physician has to type, into the medical record So he needs to, and if you're not really very good at keyboarding, you have to look at the keys like I do when I type. So there's a lot of things that are attracting that physician or healthcare worker to this and not to that person who is sitting there, who, by the way, is the reason why you're even here. It's because of that person, not because of this. The computer should be a help, should not be a hindrance. And in many cases, it is a hindrance. So,
Professor,
all of this has made comment?
Yes, I see now, right now with the consent form, because I just have a surgery to take off my wisdom teeth. And then I was like, hey, let me ask question.
Right.
They want me to sign a consent form, which is, I don't know anything about that inside the consent form. Okay. The nurse told me that just sign. I said, how come I'm gonna sign a paper that I don't know what inside of it? I need to see it. And then he said, oh, no, this is the way things work. So I said, but I don't think so. It should be like this, because I need to know what inside the paper if I do not understand the term to ask question. This is where that I am so appreciate with this class. Before, I will not ask this question. I would just sign. But now, when they see that I asked them this question, and then they bring me the paper, they print it out, they say, okay, you can read it. And then they give me a time to read it. But however, there is a nurse that told me right there, if you go to the ER, so the nurse behind the desk, they just want you to sign. You not even see it. I said, man, things need to be changed. Just like that, because this is not, the patient need to know what's going on in that form that you ask the patient to sign. So I think this is a good way to inform the people that, they're right.
I wish there were more patients like you, Gardia.
I did the same
but
thing.
Most...
I did the same thing last time I was at UM a year ago. They wanted me to sign it. I said, I have to read it. Well, you know what it says. It's just here for you to sign. I said, I know what it said when I was working here. I don't know what it says today.
Yeah.
I want to read what it says today.
Right.
So they make to sign.
Well, most people are not like you or like Gardia. Most people just check the box and sign without knowing what they're signing. This is not just not right, but it's dangerous. You don't know what you're signing. You may be signing your life away. Who knows what it is? I mean, nobody's trying to harm you, and they want to do things, let's get this done and quickly, because you have to go, to be admitted, and the nurses on the ward are waiting for you, etc., and all of that. I understand all of that.
But Professor, it's because we're not informed. As I said before, I did not aware of that.
Yeah.
Until,
you have a right. That you have
I see,
right.
I see the importance of, even though, if I do not understand, before I would say, okay, but now, even though I do not clearly, know the term, but I would say, what does that mean? It's because we need to do a work in the church. We need to let the people know, because people do not inform.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I love that today. I think that's just great. Great. I wish more people thought like that, because that's what, speaking the truth in the public square is all about. Information, forming people so that they know that these are not just nice things to do. These are your rights. You have every right to do that and demand that of the person who is asking you to sign a piece of paper without reading it.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. And right. Anyone who has been admitted to hospital knows that this happens all the time, because it's not just one piece of paper, it's many.
Yes.
Many boxes to check and many signatures to place. And, they don't want to have you read everything, because it would take too long, and there's people waiting behind you.
There's sometimes more to it. At the school, we just had our contract signed, and in the contract, they slid in that at any time they could require a medical or mental evaluation. If it hadn't been for Teresa and I requesting the union to get involved, the contract would have been signed by everybody without going through any kind of process.
Well, that's actually dishonest.
Yeah,
I don't know that many hospitals do this, but
I realize that many hospitals probably wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And I realize this, we're talking about me as a teacher and getting a job and whatever else. But the point is that whether rush or intent, the idea is when you check, you keep everybody honest.
Yes, yes. Yes, true, true. Go ahead.
I think it's also powered down because I think even from people from different cultures, you already have that trust in your provider, and it's also you're already intimidated by the provider. So you're assuming that everything you're given is true, and everything has been researched, everything is valid, and they know what's best for you. And I think there's just assumption I can trust it because you are who you are and you have the status, and that everything that you put in front of me is true. And I think it's just that power dynamic I think is being taken advantage of because people don't know. Maybe I should look through this and question you, or maybe everything here is not true or best for me. So I think it's just the people don't feel empowered to ask questions or to push back.
Yes, yes, exactly. Excellent. I agree completely. Yes, yeah. And that is probably the main reason why most people do check the box and sign. Because they're trustworthy. They still trust the person who may not be your doctor, but it's the person that is representing the healthcare team. It's a hospital staff person. Yeah. So yeah. But you don't want to have to go through what we just heard about, getting mental health evaluation without your consent. Informed consent is really very important. You need to be informed in order to consent, and you need to consent to any kind of intervention, period, any kind.
Yeah, that's what you say, intimidation. I was talking with my friend, she's a pharmacy doctor. I'm talking about certain things, and I was telling her about, well, what do you see new things about in pharmacy when you dispense medication and things like that? She said, oh, the other day, there was some medication for pain medication in the pharmacy, and one was a assistant. Question the doctor and calling him and telling him, so you give this medication, but this patient doesn't have a mask. So how are you going to give the medication if he doesn't have a mask? They say, you know what? What's your name? I want to report you to the board. You don't have to question me. The doctor told to the pharmacist. The pharmacist. And then she said, I don't care, you can do whatever since I'm not going to spend the medication. She was really strong. And then after
so they sell it.
Huh?
They sell the mask.
No, because I don't know the medications have kind of medication for pain plus a mask has to be selling. Okay, I don't know what kind specific was. And then the doctor afterwards, and then he intimidated. That is a lot of people, doctors intimidate other colleagues, other people in the health.
They do, yeah, right.
Like doing these things.
Even now.
I got a report on the board. Then after the doctor was found fraudulent for in one of the clinics, medication pain clinics. It was one of the doctors my friend was telling me.
Oh, okay, all right. So, right, doctors are people. They, number one, make mistakes, and sometimes they do things that are illegal. So, it's important. The doctor may write for a prescription, and because he was inattentive to information on the patient, and it may turn out that that person is allergic to that medicine. And the pharmacist can find out, and the pharmacist has the responsibility to not give the person that medicine because they know that, and also to call the doctor back and tell him, you switch medicine to something else so that this patient can have the benefit of the treatment without having an allergic reaction. So I think that all of these are the good things, good outcomes that have happened with this thing that we call autonomy. Not the extreme about if a patient asks you to do an abortion, you have to do an abortion because he's asking you. No, that's the extreme. If the patient requests, it conflicts with the ends of medicine, then the doctor does not have to honor that request. However, one of the good things that has happened is that patients are now more, they have become more interested in finding out how they can contribute, how they can be part of the health care that they're receiving. And even though sometimes they still are intimidated by the physician, by the white coat or whatever you want to call that, But still, people are much more outspoken now than they were 50 years ago. Okay? All right, so is there a human right? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Doctor, I have a question. Yes, this is
Yes.
About the time frame. I mean, I graduated in Venezuela. In Venezuela, we never have a time, a certain minutes to see a patient. So I don't know. I mean, we see the patient, the time that it takes. Of course, with the best intention to do the best in during the time that we're talking to the patient.
Right.
We listen and we put a treatment. So when the time come here, because I heard that, I mean, the patient has to be no more than 20, 25, 30, because you have to see 30 patients a day. I mean, this kind of I think is very important when we talk about ethical issues, no? Because I think it's more how many patients you're gonna see during the day. And that's what I see a problem comes. Was this doctor just spent 5 minutes with me and I want to talk, I want to ask, I have so many questions. So when this kind of rule time frame comes in the practice here?
So I wanted to read an excerpt from the textbook real quick for this class. It says, clinicians commonly interrupt patients after an average of 24 seconds, whether or not a patient has finished explaining the problem. A golden rule involves listening for 1 minute before interrupting. And today, one study finds that in 50% of visits, patients and doctors disagree on the main presenting problem or treatment or direction of care. So,
did you hear that, Marina?
Yeah. That's at the end of the visit. 50% disagree as to what the primary problem was.
Did you hear that?
No, because he's far from the mic. Yeah.
What can we do about that in terms of changing the training? Education?
I don't believe it's a problem with the training. I believe it's a problem with the system.
Yeah.
I think it's a system that is making people, physicians and healthcare workers, see more patients. The more patients you see, the less time you spend with each one. And there are a number of incentives from the healthcare companies. You know, the more patients you see, the larger your bonus is. So people are motivated to see many more patients because they get more money at the end of the year.
Yes, you're right, Professor. You're right. Because it's all about numbers.
It is, and dollars too.
Yes.
Yeah, right. It is. But again, right, it's the system that does that. But so your question is, what do we do about that? I don't know what we can do about that. There are now healthcare systems that are very small and that are community centered in our country.
Yes.
That allow patients to, you know, and the folks, the healthcare folks, the nurses and the doctors and so on, are not paid according to the number of patients that they see, but to the work that they do. And so that is something that can be done with a small group where you have just a couple of hundred patients in a panel. But in a large group like Kaiser or Humana or one of these where there's just thousands and thousands, it's very difficult to say to do something like that.
Yes.
There is an effort now in the medical care in this country to try to circumvent that in some way, because it's not just that the patients are complaining, it's just that it's not good medical care.
Exactly, that's my point.
Specifically for the reason that you just mentioned, at the end of the consult or at the end of the intervention, 50% are not in agreement. I mean, it's because of different reasons. The physician or the nurse practitioner was talking to the computer instead of talking to the patient. That could be one, or whoever knows. We need to be, maybe we need to go back to Hippocratic medicine.
Yep.
That would be a push, and that would take a whole lot of pushing, I guess, to do something. But I believe so. The Hippocratic tradition had the patient as the prime, as the focus was the patient.
Now it's all about money.
And it's all about other things now. It's all about the company and the community and allocation of resources and all of that. So at the very beginning, we talked about how, at the beginning of this talk, we talked about how Hippocrates, or the Hippocratic Oath, had converted this relationship into a relationship of trust and a covenant. Two people that care about each other. The patient because he cares about, the doctor because he comes to the doctor, he's chosen that doc, and the doctor because he cares, or the nurse cares about that patient, and they trust each other. That relationship has changed to a contract, which is a business-like relationship. I got something that you need, and I sell it to you, and the more times that I sell you this thing, the more money that I get back from whoever, the government, the healthcare company, United, Humana, Kaiser, whatever. Because that's the way things work now. Yeah, unfortunately, that is the situation that we have now. So, all right, any other comments? This is a really important topic, really, really important, because it's really affecting the delivery of care. It's not just that it's not right to talk to somebody and you never look at them straight in the eye. When you talk to somebody, you look at them. You don't talk to somebody while you're looking at something else. That's just not courteous, That's not how human beings relate to each other. But it's affecting the care the people are receiving. It is. It is. So is there a human right, since we're talking about all these rights? There's so many rights. It seems like there's a new right every other week. Is there a human right to health care? What do you all think?
Doctors. But now they said triage nurses. They do everything through phone. There's a nurse practitioner. They answer phones. So they have patients phone. Now there is a telehealth. It's a doctor in some of the places they see that patient in the sunroom. That's what happens now. Right there. Right. It sounds different from traditional medicine. But there are times when telemedicine is necessary. Like, and especially, some specialties like dermatology, that all you're going to do is look at a lesion, and you happen to live 500 miles away from the specialist, then you can you can take a picture of that lesion, transmit it to the specialist, who will look at it and will tell the primary care doc that the likely diagnosis is thus and such. But it doesn't work with every kind of patient, with every type of. No, but that's not tell you. This is a system now. That's what they're doing now. It's a telehealth, triage, telecommunication. Right. This is that they are doing. They pay good. They pay very good. Triage nurses get a lot of money. They do. No, yeah, but but it's the natural of the person. They say it's not work really. In my case, I say no. I need to be with a patient. You need right. No, I cannot be able to fall. No. That's no. And they say no. That isn't no. And so I applied one time. After I realized no, that's not for me. So I'm gonna apply for half maybe, and half the patient, half for phone. But no, I cannot live with. It's not no in contact with a patient. Right. Yeah. Right. There's no real contact when you're talking to the you're talking to the phone. You're not talking to the patient. Yeah. However, there's a reason for triage too. There's a reason for all these things. It's just when you take them to extremes that they just don't work. Yeah. Right. So, is there a human right to health care? What are human rights? What do you all think? Where do they come from? There's an inalienable right to life, yes. Mm-hmm. There's an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So think about this. The founding fathers are pretty smart people. You have to be alive in order to be free, in order to pursue your happiness. If you're dead, you can't do any of those things. Right? Okay? So you have to have a right to be alive, so that you can be free, so that you can be the very best doctor that you can, the very best carpenter that you can, the very best whatever you choose that you can. So you have to be alive, okay? So that's one of the rights. That's a human right. These are rights that we have received from God. These are God-given rights. They're not given to us by government or by society or by culture. They're received from God because we are created
in his image and have an inherent human dignity. And human dignity is conferred to us because we are. Not because of anything we've done. You cannot earn that. It's because you are a human being created in his image. That is what gives you, that is what confers on you human dignity. Okay? Human rights do not come from society or the government. They're founded in the natural or moral law. So we started with covenant contract. We're ending with covenant contract. We've gone from covenant to contract. We started with the natural law and we're ending with the natural law. So see, there's a reason for all these things. The secular culture, of course, does not recognize this.
What is
Sorry. I failed to click the slide. Human rights are received from God because we're created in his image. We have inherent human dignity because we're created in his image. And they are founded in the natural or the moral law. Okay? Now, the secular culture does not recognize this. Secular culture is in the practice of inventing new rights and uses the government or the judicial system pretty much to justify or validate them. They pass a law right away. The secular culture believes that human rights are man-made, and they are wrong. Human rights are God-made. They're imposed on society by different cultural mores. So if the culture gives you a right for X, Y, or Z, then they can also take that right away, right? That is the difference. When the Lord gives you that right to life, then nobody can take that right away. But if the culture is the one that confers that right to you, what can the culture do? Today gives you the right. Next week, next year, next month, it can take that right away. We know that laws change, right? Slavery was part of a law system in this country until it was abolished. So it was legal to own other people, which is the most ridiculous thing in the world. How can a human being own another human being when we're all created in the image of God, by God? But it was the law here for 200 years. So, like, if it's the law, so then it must be right. No, there are certain laws that are not correct. Roe v. Wade, if it's the law, which is what all of these people, Ezekiel and all of these other folks, it's the law, so you have to do it. But laws are sometimes wrong. What do you do when laws are wrong? You change them. How do you change them? Blood and, it takes, and sweat and tears, exactly. But you change the laws, and there are vehicles, there are ways that you can change laws. And you start by speaking the truth in the public square. Not in the private square. You can do it privately also at home, but in the public square so people can hear these things. Okay? I would hope that all of you folks live here and talk about these issues to other people because it's really important. It depends on us. We are the ones that have the responsibility to do that. So, all right, so we don't want rights that are changing and that are inconsistent. So what about health care? Most, including the secular bioethicists, not just us, but the secular people, would support a general moral right to health care. Based on what? Based on the community and based on the individual. The health of one individual affects the community. The health of one individual affects the community in a negative way, like if you have a communicable disease and you spread it, then you can create, a lot of problems in the community, like maybe an epidemic or something like that. But the individual person, the individual that is healthy and well-fed and so on, can influence the community as well, positively. So it's important that that person has the ability to seek and receive health care. So I think most people, secular and otherwise, and us, would say that there is a right to health care. Okay. So it is what is, right, the common good. I forgot about that, very important. Also, the well-being of a member of the community improves the community, but it also promotes, contributes to the common good. And the common good affects everybody, every member of the community, not just the one person. So the common good is defined as the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. Okay? Again, reach that level that we call happiness or total complete fulfillment. Okay, so.
Can you repeat the common goods?
The common good is defined as the sum total of social conditions. I'm sorry, I think I have this here. I'm forgetting to flip the slides. Beg your pardon. Sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or individuals, either a group or individual. Remember, some societies are little communities all put together. Some societies are small and they're just individuals together to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So all of these things that you need, what are the things that you need? Well, you need to be in good health. If you're sick, then you can't do this. You fulfill your life's wishes. You have to be well nourished. You have to be healthy. You have to have a roof over your head. There are certain basic considerations that you need, basic social situations that are necessary for you to be able to contribute to the common good and the good of society. So that's the common good. The human person lives in community. The civil society ought to work to preserve the health and welfare of the individual members of the community so that they can flourish and contribute to the common good. So what does a good society do or ought to do? Seeks the good. I don't want to forget any of this. Respects persons. Remember, we have the dignity. It's inherent in us because we're created by God. Ooh. We're still in the common good. That's all right. Well, they're giving a tour to these young people, yeah. Mm-hmm. So, in a good society, seeks the good, respects persons, promotes the social welfare, and preserves the peace and security of its members.
Do you have it in a slide?
No, I don't have it on the slide.
Can you repeat?
I will. A good society seeks the good, respects persons, promotes the social welfare, preserves the peace and the security of the population. And that's it. Government should not do any more. Government should not intervene with any of the private issues that are in families or communities. Government is there to preserve the peace, make sure that we're not attacked by another nation. That's the security of the nation. And provide the basic needs of the people. No more. And that includes access to medical care. Access to medical care. Access to care should be viewed within the context of rights and justice. The members of the community should have access to a basic level of care. What is basic health care for a community is determined by that community. It may be different from one community to the other. Some communities are very affluent and they can have all kinds of healthcare, included in what they call basic healthcare. Other communities are less affluent. So it's important that this basic determination be made by the community itself. Now, as well as the mode of delivery. But free market versus government is beyond the purview of this talk. So there's two ways that you can do it. You can do it through a government program, or you can do it through the free market. In this country, we prefer, so far, the free market, even though there's a lot of people that are pushing the government as a source of health care with
So
a
what is
one.
market?
Huh?
What is a
A free market is when the individual goes out to seek the care and finds the place that gives him or her the best care for the best money, for the amount of money that that person can afford. And that the government needs to provide the choices for the person to make the choice. The other kind of healthcare delivery, this is delivery now we're talking about, is when the government provides delivery, like in socialized medicine, like in England, like in Canada, where there's just one provider, and that one provider is the government. So there's only one care. You have X diagnosis, the treatment for that diagnosis is XYZ, because there's just one person, one organization that can provide the care, and that's the government. That is socialized medicine, and there's some people say there's good things about socialized medicine, and there might be some good things, but there are more bad things than good things about socialized medicine.
So we are free market.
It limits, we are free market in this country, yes. So far. Some people say that the ACA was on the way to becoming the one single provider. Because
looks very much like that.
Yeah, right. So we'll see. Okay, so are we our brother's keeper?
Yes.
Remember that? When the Lord came to Cain and he asked Cain, "Where is your brother?" And Cain's guilty conscience, he just said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And the answer is, yes, we are. We are our brother's keeper. We are to take care of each other. Remember the great commandment, I think that's in Mark 12, that one of the scribes or the Pharisees asked the Lord, and he said that the great commandment was, love the Lord, your God, above yourself, with your heart, with your gut, with your brain, with your everything, and your neighbor as yourself. So those two are the 10 commandments in them, Half are for God, the other half are for your fellow man. So are we our brother's keeper? Yes, we are our brother's keeper. We need to remember that. And I would like to end, right, till 12:30 you said, right? Okay, we're almost to 12:30. I would like to end with the ethical and religious directives, this thing that I think you all have a copy of, right? For Catholic healthcare services. I thought that we could do that because if you look at the ones that I picked, I was picky here, okay? Apologize for that. But I went to the chapter that starts in page 15 that talks about the doctor-patient relationship. And I chosen some of the key statements that are made. It says part 3, professional-patient relationship, page 15. I think there's a couple more, not anymore. You took them, right? Okay. And I picked some of those. I did not write them out on the slide, but I did outline them here so that I would like for us to read them together. And I promise not to go beyond 12:30. The purpose of these ethical and religious directives is twofold. Number 1, which is right there on the slide, to reaffirm the ethical standards of behavior in healthcare that flow from the Church's teaching about the dignity of the human person. Number 2, to provide authoritative guidance on certain moral issues that face Catholic healthcare today. And you think, well, people down in Hippocrates' time did not have the problem of abortion that we have now. Yes, they did. In fact, abortion is one of the issues that is mentioned in the Hippocratic Oath. And it's stated very clearly that we will not abort a pregnant woman. It's stated very clearly. What do you think the secular media culture did to the Hippocratic Oath? They removed that part because it's legal to do abortions in this country and in most places around the world. Yeah. All right. So the moral teachings that we profess flow principally from the natural law, understood in the light of the revelation Christ has entrusted to his church. From this source, the church has derived its understanding of the nature of the human person, of human acts, and of the goals that shape human activity. The dialogue between medical science and Christian faith has its primary purpose, the common good of all human persons. This is all from this document. We're using the same terms that we've discussed all morning. It presupposes that science and faith do not contradict each other. Both are grounded in respect for truth and freedom. Okay? There's the argument that that faith or revelation, in other words, and science are antagonistic, are different. If you're a religious person, then you're anti-science. And you hear people say that frequently, and that could be furthest from the truth. Not at all. So, if you look at page 15, a person in need of health care and the professional health care provider who accepts the person as a patient enter into a relationship that requires mutual respect, trust, honesty, and appropriate confidentiality. That is the first paragraph in that page 15. Also in page 15, the healthcare professional has the knowledge and experience to pursue the goals of healing. Remember, ends of medicine, health, cure, and care. We are in the business of healing, not of doing harm, and certainly not of killing. We're not executioners. The maintenance of health, that's care, and the compassionate care of the dying, not euthanasia, taking into account the patient's beliefs and spiritual needs and the moral responsibilities of all concerned. That's toward the bottom of the page. Still page 15. And the very last on page 15, the patient in turn, the patient has responsibilities, not just ours, to use the physical and spiritual resources in the service of his own personal moral and spiritual goals to the best of his or her ability. The doctor-patient relationship is a dyad. This is why I don't think we can separate the doctor from the patient, because there would not be a relationship unless they are together. They are together. And then the fourth, I guess, that I think is important is number 24. Is it? Yes. Each person must be given the opportunity to make an advance directive for their medical treatment. Again, this is one of the important offshoots of the autonomy movement, which is a good thing. Patients have a voice. Patients can speak. Patients can ask questions. And not only that, patients can disagree. I don't think that's the right thing for me because, and you explain, one of the things that just happened on Thursday, I had a small group discussion with the medical students. We were talking about clinical scenarios and so on. And I kept saying, talk to each other, talk to the people. There's no way that you cannot just rule your life by laws and regulations. You have to talk to each other. Most of the time, maybe not all of the time, but most of the time, by talking, by connecting, you can solve most problems. But people just don't talk to each other now. What do? Yeah, they talk to little machines that they carry in their pockets. That's what they do, unfortunately. Again, there's nothing wrong with the cell phone. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful trinket. But when you take it to extreme, that you don't talk to people anymore, but you talk to this, then that's the extreme. But human beings tend to do that. They tend to take issues to the extreme. Number 5, each person, that's page 20. No, that's directive is number 5. Yeah, 25. 25? Each person, directive 25. Each person may identify in advance a representative to make healthcare decisions as his or her surrogate in the event that the person loses the capacity to make healthcare decisions. So these are the 2 good things, but it's actually consent, advance directives, and naming, designating a surrogate. Number 6 is free and fully informed consent of the person or the person's surrogate is required for all medical treatments and procedures, including the use of experimental protocols. Like Dr. O'Sullivan mentioned before, and very well said, it is very important that the individual who is being treated, intervene in any way, knows and consents to that intervention. And that is number, which one? 26 and 27 deal with that. Free and informed consent. Free and informed health care decisions by the patient or his or her surrogate will be followed so long as it does not contradict church doctrine. Mrs. Jones comes in and tells you that she wants an abortion, and you're not going to give her the abortion because that is in conflict with the ends of medicine. Okay? All right, that's not a very good example, but it's just an example. Number 7, free and informed consent. Free and informed health care decisions by the patient or his surrogate will be followed so long as it does, oh no, that's not the one that I just read, does not contradict church doctrine. Number 8, no person should be obliged to submit to a health care procedure that the person has judged with a free and informed conscience not to provide a reasonable benefit without imposing excessive risk and burden. You can refuse. Remember, you can refuse as a patient. You can refuse. That is number 32. Let me just confirm that.
Yes.
It is? Okay. All right. Number 9. Healthcare providers are to respect each person's privacy and confidentiality. Would you know that this is also in the original Hippocratic Oath? Okay. You shall not divulge what your patient tells you in private to anyone other, including their family, unless the person gives you a permission to do that. Number 34. And then number 37, an ethics committee or some other form of ethics consultation should be available to assist in particular ethical situations. And this is exactly 12:30. How do you like that? All right. So I did not overstep my bounds here. Now, any questions about an ethics committee? Because that's the one thing we didn't touch on today. You know what that is? Are you familiar with the term? You know who makes up an ethics committee?
What we talk in my lesson, the lesson that but I don't know, you want to add something, doctor, about it?
Go ahead, speak.
No, I mean, that was the module that
Oh, that was a module that
I presented, yes.
Okay. So
but maybe you can add something.
Oh, okay. No. If it was already a talk that you had, then it's not necessary. But the ethics committees are important. They're also a result of giving patients the opportunity, and families, I guess. Many times it's families, the opportunity to bring issues up and discuss issues and so on with the healthcare team. And it's important that the ethics committee be made up of members that are, in the healthcare team, even the ones that are part of the healthcare team of the individual patient, but also others, and also folks that are not of the medical persuasion, like pastors or priests, depending upon the individual's church allegiance, and some others. I've had committees that they have calls for. Remember, my background is in pediatrics, so I've had committees that the family has called a trusted teacher of the child to come and be part of the committee and tell the committee that so the enrollment is open. It's an open enrollment, and it's for the patient, for the family. Okay. Again, and also remember that the ethics committee makes recommendations. The ethics committee does not make laws. The primary care docs and the healthcare team can actually not follow the recommendations of the ethics committee. They have to have a pretty powerful reason to do that, but they can't, because the ethics committee does not have, their recommendations do not have to be followed to the T. They can be followed partially or maybe even not at all. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you to you.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Thank you, doctor.
Father. Go make it.
Sorry.